day, everyone, and welcome to today's Honest Utilities call. Please note this call is recorded. It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Holly Bender.
Hello, everyone. My name is Holly Bender. I'm the Regional Campaign Director for Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign. You've dialed into Sierra Club's webinar teleconference on the Dirty Truth About Utility Climate Pledges report. In this 30-minute webinar, we will go over why we made the report, which grades utilities on their energy transition plans, how we calculated the scores, our top-line findings, and our recommendations for what utilities need to do to meet critical climate goals by 2030. The Biden administration has set a bold climate agenda, including a goal of 100% clean electricity by 2035. That goal is visionary, ambitious, and achievable. To get there, electric utility companies play a pivotal role. This report provides new analysis that despite a spate of climate pledges and a few utilities that stand out as leaders, America's electric utilities are not planning the concrete steps, including retiring fossil fuel plants and replacing them with clean energy, that are necessary to avert the worst impacts of the climate crisis. In fact, the report reveals that many utilities plan to build an enormous amount of new gas generation, further risking climate progress. This report grades the 50 largest utility companies, and stay tuned for the surprising utility with the best grade, and includes an interactive website, detailed maps, and a comprehensive analytical dashboard for each company. The speakers on this webinar will present the findings of the report, how to use the dashboard, the website, and what utilities can do to improve their grades. The speakers include John Romankiewicz, last name spelled R-O-M-A-N-K-I-E-W-I-C-Z, Senior Analyst for Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign, Kara Bottorff, C-A-R-A-B-O-T-T-O-R-F-F, Electric Sector Analyst at the Sierra Club, and Professor Leah Stokes, L-E-A-H-S-T-O-K-E-S, an Associate Professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. There will be time for questions and answers at the end of the webinar with instructions on how to ask your questions at the end. And with that, I will pass it to my colleague, John Romankiewicz.
Thank you, Holly. Dill, if you could switch to slide 2, thanks so much. Why did we make this report? The next decade is critical to averting the worst impacts of the climate crisis and transforming our economy to run entirely on clean energy. According to the IPCC's 1.5 degrees Celsius report, the best pathway is to reduce emissions globally and economy-wide by 45 to 50% by 2030 to put us on that 1.5 pathway. The electric sector in the U.S. is key to reaching this goal, A, because it has the technologies to do this right now, and they're affordable and reliable, and because the electric sector is the linchpin for decarbonizing transportation, buildings, and industry through electrification. We cannot electrify everything and reduce carbon emissions in those sectors without a supply of clean electricity, after all. So despite the pressing deadline of 2030, utilities are either not moving fast enough towards these goals or not moving at all. Many of them are trying to greenwash by making climate pledges for 30 years from now without outlining what they're going to do in the next decade, which is critical. Our report really finds that the vast majority of these commitments are hot air. We're going to show you why. With clean energy technologies now cost competitive with coal and gas, utilities can affordably and rapidly switch to renewables at a much faster pace than they currently plan to do, all while creating thousands of jobs and supporting frontline communities. We hope this scorecard and its corresponding website and dashboard will put pressure on utilities, investors, regulators, policymakers, the media, and the public to push their utilities for real plans to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy. So which utilities do we look at? This report grades the largest 50 utility parent companies ranked in terms of overall coal and gas generation that they own right now. In total, These 50 companies comprise 79 operating companies, and we've collected a lot of data over the past decade that we've been tracking and advocating for these changes. Merchant generators are not included because their generation assets aren't often rate regulated, and they aren't required to replace any capacity that retire. If you could move to the next slide, Adil. So on slide 3 here, we can see our score methodology. Scores are based on utilities' energy plans, often called integrated resource plans, and other public corporate announcements they've made. And our data was collected with a cutoff date of December 1st, 2020. So it's very current. We supplement with data from S&P Global Market Intelligence, which itself is culled from sources that these companies report to, like the Energy Information Administration and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Our score is based on what we've been advocating for the past 5 to 10 years. Retire existing coal plants by 2030 and build clean energy to replace it. Don't build any new gas plants. We chose these 3 factors because these are the decisions that really matter for reducing emissions in this decade. So a utility earns points by committing to retire coal by 2030 or sooner. We account for all their plans to build clean energy between 2020 and 2030, that entire 10, 11-year period. And utilities lose points or are penalized by making any plans or intentions to build new gas. It's a score from 0 to 100, and once they receive a score, they're assigned a letter grade according to the following metrics. So A is 75 and above, B 50 to 75, C 35 to 50, D is 17 and a half to 35, and F is below that metric. So if you could switch to the next slide, we'll get into some of the results. So on slide 4, this is what I was mentioning before about some of this hot air. Net zero pledges for 30 years from now, for 2050, are meaningless without significant action prior to 2030 that will get us on the pathway for 1.5C. We found that there was about 20 companies out of the 50 we studied that had a net zero pledge, and their aggregate score was only a 20 out of 100, whereas companies without such a pledge scored a 14 out of 100. So 20 versus 14 on a 100-point scale is not a meaningful difference. It shows that these pledges have not led to any appreciable amount of near-term ambition or action. You can see that the percent of coal committed to retire by 2030 between these groups was 27 and 23%. So again, no meaningful difference. Actually, we noticed that the utilities with net zero pledges were actually planning in aggregate to build more new gas, 22 gigawatts, relative to the companies without those pledges. So we're left asking, why are you building more fossil fuels when you're trying to reduce emissions? Now switching to slide 5. Here's our suite of 50 companies, and you can see the letter grades indicated by the color scale there, A through F. 25 out of the 50 companies are getting an F, a failing grade. The average utility score is a 17 out of 100, which shows how little ambition utilities have in this critical moment. So these are kind of the aggregate scores. Underlying that data is all the data on whether they plan to retire their coal or not, whether they plan to build new gas or not, and how much clean energy they're building. To dive into some of those findings on coal, gas, and clean energy, I'm going to turn it over to Kara Bottorff, my colleague and analyst at the Sierra Club.
Thanks, John. You can go ahead to go to the next slide. So I'm going to be digging into our results a little bit more, starting with some of our key findings around coal. So out of all the companies that we studied that John was just outlining, they accounted for 68% of the remaining coal generation, even though they generated only 44% of total electricity. So what that means is that they have very coal-heavy portfolios. In aggregate, the 50 companies are only committed to retiring 25% of all of that coal, and that has serious impacts. It has impacts to greenhouse gases, however, it also has impacts to people's health. If all of these remaining coal plants studied were to be retired by 2030, as we suggest, it would help avoid over 2,800 premature deaths, 1,700 heart attacks, and 18,000 asthma attacks every year. So who are the main culprits here? If we're going to look at the top companies that still have the most remaining coal generation that does not yet have a 2030 retirement commitment, in order of worst to slightly less worse, we have Duke Energy, Berkshire Hathaway, Southern Company, and American Electric Power Company, AEP, as those top worst offenders. Next slide. So looking at some of our gas key findings next, we found that out of these companies, 32 are planning to build new gas, which is almost certain to become a stranded asset. When I say that, that's based on some research by Rocky Mountain Institute, which we cite in our paper. They found that nationally, utilities and other investors are planning to invest over $7 billion in new gas plants through 2025, even though 90% of those plants would be more costly than an equivalent clean energy replacement. So this is not going to make economic sense. These 32 companies that are planning to build new gas, the amount of gas that they are planning accounts for almost 40% of all the currently planned gas across the U.S. So again, these are fossil fuel heavy. They're fossil fuel heavy in what they're currently operating, and they're fossil fuel heavy really even in what they're looking to keep operating into the future. 11 of these companies are actually planning to build an additional 17 gigawatts of gas after 2030. So that is way, way, way too far to still be considering building new gas. Again, looking at the worst offenders, it's some familiar names, I'm sure. We've got Duke Energy planning the most gas out of any of these companies, followed by Tennessee Valley Authority, Entergy, NextEra, Xcel, and Dominion. Next slide. Some of our key findings around clean energy. Next, so we looked at how much clean energy these companies were actually planning to build, and we found that their plans to build new clean energy would only be able to replace about 20% of their existing coal and gas generation. So obviously, if they really want to move to a clean energy future, that's nowhere near enough to get us there. Across all the companies that we studied, there were about 100,000 megawatts of planned wind and solar additions. That might sound like a lot, but for some context, we would need about 5 times that amount to fully replace the coal and gas generation with clean energy, which again is what we know we need to do if we're going to actually wind up with a clean energy future. Next slide. So that's some of what we found from their actual action plans. So they have their action plans that say, here's the resources we have, here's what we're planning to build, and when. However, they also like to state these sort of more broad goals about their climate pledges. So of the 50 companies that we studied, 33 of them had a corporate climate pledge, something that they say they're going to do in the future in order to improve how, quote, green they are. 23 of those companies actually had a goal for 2030, so in the next decade, which we're focusing on. However, this is where the number gets a little bit sad. Only 4 of those companies were actually aiming for emissions reductions of greater than or equal to 80% by 2030, which is what we need in order to be on a 1.5 degree pathway and actually get ourselves to a clean energy future. Next slide. Digging in a little more on what we mean when we're grading these companies as A, B, C, D, F companies, we found some characteristics that may not totally surprise you about what distinguishes an A company from an F company. So starting with what they're thinking about coal. So the companies that received an A here were actually planning to retire 100% of their coal by 2030. However, companies that received an F had plans to only retire 7% of their coal. The companies that received an A also were planning to build no new gas by 2030 compared to the companies that received an F, which were planning to build over 20,000 megawatts of new gas. Next slide. So we've talked through a whole bunch of data here. We have even more data for you if you're interested in digging into this even more deeply for a specific utility that you work on. Want to see the data laid out and make comparisons between utilities, you can go to our dashboard, which is linked on our website, and I believe went out with the press release for this. And you can go and you can look by parent company or by operating company and see all the metrics that went into this score, as well as some other metrics like efficiency data that can tell you about where each company is in terms of their fossil fuels that are still online, their gas that they're planning, and their clean energy plans, along with their score. Next slide. The dashboard includes a whole bunch of stuff. So you can look at these metrics by operating company or parent company. You can also look at a comparative spread that we've already built out for you that compares coal and clean plans by company. You can also look at, I was listing some of the top worst gas and coal offenders here. You can look at a more full ranking of those on our dashboard as well, see where your company of interest falls. We also have maps that lay out the scores by operating company or parent company, so you can see the territories of these different companies. And one thing that the map makes really clear if you go in there and you look at it is that you can get an A anywhere in the U.S. We have A companies and we have F companies in totally different geographies. It's not that only one area of the U.S. is able to do these things. You really can be a good utility anywhere. You just have to commit to it. We also have an energy efficiency leaderboard where you can see how these companies, at least the ones that report, not all of them report their energy efficiency data, but for those that do, you can go check that out. And then we also have our data sources listed in there as well if you want to dig into where a lot of this came from. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Leah Stokes, Assistant Professor at the University of California at Santa Barbara, to zoom out and sort of talk about some of these things on a broader scale.
Thanks so much, Kara and John. I just want to say first off the bat that Kara and John at the Sierra Club really did exceptional work for this paper. You know, you might ask, what's new here? Well, it's all new. You can't get this data anywhere else unless you want to go through the painstaking work that John and Kara went through in terms of compiling all this information from IRPs, current generation data, you know, all the different plans and pledges that utilities have been putting out in different forums. And what they did is, like a little investigative journalist, they went through all those sources and they put them together in a way that's really never been done before. And that lets us look at, you know, not just the pledges on paper, but really the actions in terms of the plans to build new gas, the plans to retire coal, and the plans to build new clean power. And it's those invested decisions that are really critical for making a difference on climate change. It's not just sort of empty words and empty pledges on paper. So that's where this report brings so much value added. And as Kara was just talking about, there is a really excellent dashboard website that you can look at all the data yourself. So if you're doing reporting on this and you're wondering, you know, what's going on with a specific utility, you can go to the website and pull up their data and get a good sense of their plans and practice. And, you know, we've already been seeing since the report came out yesterday, a lot of just people, individual customers across this country looking up the information and sort of being appalled by what their utilities are doing. So I think that there's going to be a lot of potential for the amazing network that is the Sierra Club to use this information and really leverage it into changes all across this country. So I feel that what this report really does is it helps cut through some of the greenwashing that can be put forward by utilities and can really trip up reporters, because it's you know, completely fair to say, oh, wow, look, this utility made a pledge in a report that they want to cut their emissions. But we've got to remember that words are not the same as actions, and we have to be going back to the basics here, which is looking at the actions, and that's really what this report does. In terms of how does it compare to work that others are doing, I think it really underlines the same kinds of findings that are coming out from other organizations in kind of independent reports and analyses over the last few months. So the Energy and Policy Institute, a utility watchdog group, put out a report in the fall, I believe in December, that looked at what are utilities doing to be on track to meet Biden's bold plan for 100% clean electricity by 2035. And what they found is that utilities pretty much across the board are not on track to do that they are really procrastinating in terms of cleaning up their electricity mix. And then actually the same day that our report came out, another report from the Energy Transition Institute that was just focused on Duke. If you look at our report, you'll notice that there's a detailed look at Duke in and of itself in a call-out box near the end of the report. And this report by the Energy Transition Institute did a similar exercise and dug in on Duke's plans and found really the same thing, which is that Duke is not stepping up to really be cleaning up its portfolio in any kind of meaningful way. So just to step back about what this is really about here, I think that what it shows us is that we need government policy to get us where we need to go. We cannot just rely on voluntary corporate pledges from utilities, because when we look I'm just going to continue. When we look at those voluntary pledges from utilities, we can see that they do not add up to what is necessary. So we need federal action on this issue. Of course, many states and many cities have already led the way. We have 16 states in this country already targeting 100% clean electricity. We have 170 cities by last count by the Sierra Club targeting 100%. But we need that to be scaled up to the federal level. And that is why the Biden campaign pledge for 100% clean electricity by 2035 is so powerful. We can't imagine that somehow economics alone or sort of the will of utilities alone will get us there. It will not. And what we really should be targeting, as this report says, is an 80% reduction by 2030. And that is doable. How do we know? Well, almost all the utilities in Colorado are already doing that under law and under various agreements with the state government in Colorado. And Google, the company Google, which is one of the largest electricity consumers in the country, actually has a 2030 pledge to do 100% clean power in real time to all its facilities. So 2030 really is a critical timeline, and we've got to be focusing on 80% reduction in our electricity sector emissions by 2030. And we know that this is doable if we just get our federal government to act. And at this point, I will hand it back to the rest of the team.
Thank you, everyone. That was Assistant Professor Leah Stokes. Thank you, Leah, for joining us, and Kara Botorp and John Romankowitz, analysts with the Sierra Club team. I want to be sure we have time for your questions. I hope that today's presentation and the time you're able to spend with the dashboard and the detailed data set that is available on the Sierra Club's website gives you a better understanding of both the challenge and the opportunity presented by the U.S. power sector, and that this catalyzes a conversation both around the opportunity to leverage clean energy solutions in this very important sector that will unlock the decarbonization potential of transportation and buildings and beyond, but also what you heard from Leah, that there's accountability here that we all play a part in ensuring that when a utility says that it has a climate goal, that's backed up with real concrete action. We see this report and its audiences as governors' offices and folks looking to build clean energy economies, regulators who are deciding every day whether to approve continued investment in aging fossil fuel plants or new gas-fired plants, and of course, Wall Street analysts who view this industry through an ESG lens. So I will just quickly remind folks that all of this information is available at sc.org/utility pledges. We do plan to do a follow-up webinar with the investment community. But for now, I will open it up for questions that you all may have for our panel.
Christy, would you like to remind listeners how to submit questions, please? Well, in the meantime, this is Brian Willis. I'll begin reading off the ones submitted so far. The first one comes from Molly Samuel from NPR in Atlanta. How do you factor in nuclear? I'm thinking of Georgia Power and Fosco eventually coming online. John, do you want to answer that one?
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. The short answer is that nuclear is not factored into the score at all. We're really looking at remaining fossil fuels that the utilities have. So how much coal and gas generation did they have in the calendar year 2019? How much of that coal is committed to retire? And then how much new clean energy, wind and solar, are they planning to build relative to that their current fossil generation? Those are the key metrics building out our score. Now, if a nuclear plant were to come offline, that would only kind of increase the clean energy we would need to build. So, in short, it's not part of our score because we're really just trying to compare fossil fuels and how quickly a company can get off of fossil fuels.
And if I can just add to what John said, in the vast majority of this country, there aren't new nuclear plants being built. There's only a couple, as the questioner pointed out, in one location. So in the vast majority of places, this isn't really relevant to the conversation, even if, some people may want new nuclear to be built. The fact is there's very little of that happening in practice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Adil Trehan from the Sierra Club. I'd just like to say that if you would like to submit a question, the Q&A box is just to the left of your screen, and you can type something in there and hit submit, and we will see that. Thank you.
Thank you, Adil. This is Brian Willis again. The next question comes from Green Tech Media, Jeff St. John. What policies will give utilities the carrots and or sticks to change the current course of action? Can you give us some examples?
I'm happy to take that one. This is Leah. A clean electricity standard is a very proven way to rapidly increase clean energy. And it doesn't even need to cost very much money or even any money for ratepayers. There's, of course, another report that I didn't mention, the 2035 report. It's 2035report.com. And we definitely cite and build on that work. And what it shows is that actually cleaning up our electricity system by 90% by 2035 can even save customers money, because we know that throughout the Midwest and parts of the Southeast, there are old, dirty coal plants still online. And so a clean electricity standard says that we are moving in this direction at the pace and scale necessary. And that's why this federal push that Biden is very likely to make, given his campaign promises, will be so critical to cleaning up our electricity system in the coming decade.
And this is Holly Bender with the Sierra Club. I would just like to add on to that, in addition to clean energy being less expensive than aging fossil fuel plants, those fossil fuel plants still lack many of the modern pollution controls. 75% of existing coal plants out there today still operating without a retirement date lack the basic modern pollution controls that a new power plant would have. And so the Biden administration has a huge opportunity to finally, once and for all, close loopholes and strengthen clean air rules, clean water rules that currently allow these polluters. We're talking about carbon pollution and climate change today, but these are also some of the most notorious polluters in the communities where they operate, emitting particulate matter, mercury, sulfur dioxide. And so there's a huge opportunity, too, to ensure that if these aging coal plants paid the true cost of the externalities that they cause in terms of public health harm, they would no longer be even close to competitive with clean energy, and arguably they already are not.
Thank you, Holly. The next question comes to us from the San Antonio Current. It says CTS Energy frequently tries to divert questions away from its coal investment by pointing out how much it invested so far in solar. Did any of these utilities' investments in renewables factor into their scores? If so, why not?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is John Romankowitz here with Sierra Club. So, yes, absolutely. We are taking into account all of the utilities' public renewables plans for 2020 to 2030. Regardless of whether they're planning to buy that power via a power purchase agreement or own it themselves, we are taking into account those plans. So for CPS Energy, they've recently issued a request for proposals for, I think, or qualifications for up to about 800 megawatts or so of solar. And so, for example, we're including that for now, even though the plans are still not fully certain, and we're looking for further coal retirement commitments from that particular utility. We are giving them the credit for the renewables they plan to build in this decade.
Thank you, John. The next question comes from the Arizona Republic, Ryan Rendazio. Is it correct that the study does not account for PPAs or power purchase agreements that may contract for solar and wind, et cetera, to replace fossil fuels?
I could take that one again. So long as the solar or wind project comes online between the years 2020 and 2030, and thus leads to an incremental impact in cutting into fossil generation, we account for it, regardless of whether it's via a power purchase agreement or via the utility owning it directly. As long as those contracts are in place, we'll account for them.
Awesome. Adil here again, just reminding everyone, if you would like to submit a question, the question box is right on your screen off to the left.
And if we're waiting a second here for another question, I just want to send a shout out to Ryan Rendazzo, who is a great reporter in Arizona and indeed was featured on a podcast we just did about Arizona Public Services commitments and challenges on the podcast A Matter of Degrees. So if people are interested in digging into the Arizona story and learning about Ryan's intrepid work, I'd recommend people check that out.
Okay. Looks like we're running dry on questions. Do any of the speakers have any additional points that they'd like to point out? Any additional points that they'd like to point out based on the questions that reporters have asked or any additional information that has come to mind?
Brian, if I might, I think we've been getting a lot of questions about our baseline year and giving credit for renewables that utilities already have on the system. I'd just like to make 2 points there. So first is that we're using a 2019 baseline. We believe, we need to reset to the current state of affairs. We need to use a baseline that's current and relevant. Obviously, it's great that utilities have taken action in the past decade, and we applaud that. However, when the goal is zero fossil fuels, we want to look at the most current data and make sure that they're not expanding fossil fuels, that they're committing to retiring coal and getting down to fossil fuels as quickly as possible. We want to know their ambition, their real ambition for incremental clean energy in this decade. So I would say that when the goal is zero fossil fuels, your baseline year doesn't really matter. All that matters is your goal year. How quickly are you moving to zero fossil fuel?
Thank you, John. Well, if there are no other questions, we will conclude the webinar teleconference. This call was recorded, so we will make it available as soon as we've downloaded it and refined the file. If you have any additional questions, be sure to contact me. That's Brian Willis. That's BRIAN .WILLIS at sierraclub.org. That's BRIAN .WILLIS at sierraclub.org. Thank you so much for your time.